I'm Tom Landy. I'm the founder and director of Collegium, which is a colloquy on faith and intellectual life. Since 1993, Collegium has sponsored annual colloquies on faith and intellectual life for faculty from 60 plus Catholic colleges and universities in the US and in Canada. We were founded in 1992 to help faculty at those colleges and universities better understand the mission of Catholic higher education and to invite them and prepare them to become leaders in advancing that mission in creative ways. And I'll say ironically that at Holy Cross, where I am, our new president is one of those alums, and at University of Portland, where Norah is, one of their new deans is one of our alums. So we're happy about both of those things. Collegium is best known for its annual week-long summer colloquy on faith and intellectual life, where faculty from all religious traditions and disciplines can learn about the legacy and priorities of Catholic higher education, where they can think about their own vocation as teachers and scholars and discern how their commitments and talents can enhance the mission of their institution. Almost 2,000 faculty have participated in those colloquies over 27 years, and the keynote talks, intensive small discussions, group discussions, and opportunities for reflection and prayer are interwoven in the ways we leave participants feeling intellectually invigorated with a renewed sense of purpose. Throughout the year, Collegium also extends its mission through publications, talks, small grant opportunities, and other means of support. And tonight is one such great opportunity. I welcome all of our Collegium alumni, participants from our member schools, and anyone else who's joining us tonight. I'm pleased especially to welcome Vince Miller of the University of Dayton for a talk and discussion to help us think about environmentalism and the mission of Catholic higher education. The lecture is part of a series called Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought, co-organized by Bernard Prusak, a Collegium alum and supporter at King's College in Pennsylvania, and Jennifer Reed Booley of the College of St. Mary in Nebraska. The lecture features is part of a work in progress that will appear as chapters in the volume Catholic Social Thought in Light of Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought, Critical Constructive Essays. Forgive me, I told people just before then I lost my glasses and found them, and other than not being able to get online too, it's completely thrown me. So those are going to be forthcoming in terms of Paulus Press. So Vince Miller is, since 2009, the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Theology and Culture at the University of Dayton. Prior to that, he was Associate Professor in Theology at Georgetown University, where he taught from 1997 to 2009. I've tried to think about Vince's career from what I could see, and it's hard to pin down a single area of theological expertise when you look at his publications. And I mean that entirely as a compliment. He has published in a variety of theological reflections on areas from ecology, media, consumer culture, higher education, neoliberalism, and global education. He teaches ecclesiology, Christian anthropology, and ethics. His mind is quite capacious, which I admire. After Vince's talk, we'll hear a response from Norah Martin, who is chair of the board for Collegium, having served on its board since 2017. She was a faculty fellow in 2004. She served as a mentor and a presenter a number of times. In her day job, she's a philosophy professor at the University of Portland and chair of environmental studies. She served as associate dean at UP before returning to full-time faculty. At Collegium, she regularly advocates to help make us more sustainable in our practices. And I know that she also holds a distinction for me of being the only person I know who lives on a houseboat. So Norah will respond after Vince's presentation, after which she will turn it over for questions. First, let me welcome Vince, whose talk is entitled Higher Education, the Ecological Crisis, and the Technocratic Platform. We are recording tonight's event, and if you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and I will pose them later on. So welcome, Vince Miller.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to Norah for agreeing to respond to this paper. And also thanks to Bernard and Jennifer for organizing this project. It's nice to be here tonight. So tonight I want to consider the challenges that the climate and ecological crises pose for Catholic colleges and universities. We use the concepts of the Technocratic Paradigm and integral ecology from Laudato Si as resources for engaging those crises as institutions of higher education. I'm going to argue that Laudato Si's analysis provides a way of broadening the conversation beyond ethics to include epistemology and forms of thought, which provides a much more comprehensive way for Catholic colleges and universities to consider the crises in their own intellectual life and pedagogical work, to consider these crises in their own intellectual life and pedagogical work, and to contribute to broader work on these issues. So the unfolding ecological and climate crises pose a profound challenge to Catholic higher education. They pose a profound challenge to all contemporary institutions. Catholic social thought provides a valuable resource for facing this challenge. When we think about Catholic higher education's mission and the ecological crises, we often think of issues like practical issues like investment portfolio, energy use, physical plant. And those are important questions to which Catholic colleges and universities have exercised leadership and responsibility. These actions are often considered as essential for mission, but mission in its common use often has multiple overlapping intensive meanings. Mission-driven investments and energy policies are sometimes ascribed to the religious character of the institution, a sacrifice and action that it must make to remain true to its identity. There is much that is good in this portrayal of mission, but it can relegate these actions and practices to a realm outside of its central educational mission. They may attract students, but they're not integrated into the educational life of the university. Catholic social thought is likewise frequently understood primarily in normative and moral terms. This is, of course, no surprise regarding the church's social ethics. Laudato Si was widely greeted by climate experts and advocates as bringing the moral force of the Catholic Church to bear on the issue, both to guide its believers and to contribute to global civil society. So it was received largely as a moral document. But Catholic social thought and magisterial social doctrine address much more than ethics. As the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church manifests, Catholic social thought includes extended reflections on the nature of reality, ontology, the human person, anthropology, and society, sociology in a substantial sense. Indeed, Laudato Si expands Catholic social thought into matters of epistemology and forms of inquiry. It argues that the crises we face are not simply the result of moral failure, but of a failure to properly understand the nature of reality and the human person, and a failure in the dominant forms of thinking. Thus, both Catholic social thought and its relevance to the ecological crises are much more than matters of moral motivation that can be relegated to an ethics requirement within the curriculum for philosophy or theology to handle. They concern matters that cut to the heart of the university's educational mission and affect every department and major. So this paper will consider the diagnoses of the source of our environmental crisis offered by Laudato Si in terms of its concept, the Technocratic Paradigm, and use that as a lens to evaluate contemporary Catholic higher education. It will then turn to integral ecology, Laudato Si's proposal for an alternative thought form, paying particular attention both to its epistemological and ethical dimensions. So part one, the Technocratic Paradigm. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis offers an analysis of the human roots of the ecological crisis, a key aspect of which in his discussion is his discussion of the Technocratic Paradigm, a term which extends the Encyclical's moral critique, as I said, into dominant forms of thought. The Technocratic Paradigm is not a critique of technology itself, but of its modern forms, and thus it's still a very broad critique. It's seen as a distorted imagination of the human relationship to the rest of creation. Quote, it exalts the concept of a subject who, using logical and rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object, end quote. This is contrasted with earlier human interventions in nature, which involved, quote, being in tune with and respecting the possibilities offered by the things themselves. The Encyclical does not present the Technocratic Paradigm as a foreign or secular imposition upon Christianity, but sees it as arising from an inadequate presentation of Christian anthropology, which, quote, gave rise to a wrong understanding of the relationship between human beings and the world. So the Encyclical interprets the biblical notion of dominion, sees this misinterpretation of the biblical notion of dominion in Promethean terms. Ultimately, the Encyclical argues even humans themselves are drawn into this objectification. Although it's rooted in an anthropological error, the technocratic paradigm is not simply an idea or a doctrine. It is mediated materially in the practices of science and engineering and in technological products themselves, which are, quote, not neutral. Indeed, quote, they condition lifestyles and social possibilities and threaten to dominate users with their internal logic. Laudato Si finds this paradigm manifest in economics as well as in the economic dominance of that form of thought over the rest of society. The idea of infinite or unlimited growth rests upon this objectifying view of nature, quote, the lie that there is an infinite supply of the earth's goods and that the negative effects of their exploitation, of the exploitation of the natural order can be easily absorbed, end quote. It is also manifest in the eclipse of politics by economic notions of policy, dominated in particular by finance. The dominant neoliberal policy approach of prescribing economic growth as a solution to all problems is cited here. The aspect of the technocratic paradigm most relevant to education is Francis' description of it as an epistemology and a way of thinking. It is an epistemological paradigm, he says, which tends to generalize, quote, the method and aims of science and technology in a way that shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society. Deeper into thinking of it as a form of thought, the specialization and fragmentation of technical knowledge are the source of its great practical power. But this very specialization, quote, makes it difficult to see the larger picture and can lead to a loss of appreciation for the whole and for the relationship between things. It is particularly inadequate for complex problems such as the environment, poverty, problems that cannot be dealt with from a single perspective or from a single set of interests. So the technocratic paradigm begins with this rather broad and strong critique of technology, but then it hones into this way of thinking in terms of specialization and focus, which is a source of great innovation, but also its tunnel vision tends to cut off these broader connections. So that part of the critique I find more valuable than the general critique that it begins with. The encyclical calls for a different, more integral vision. In order to address the ecological crises, we need, quote, a distinctive way of looking at things, a way of thinking, policies, an educational program, a lifestyle and a spirituality which together generate resistance to the assault of the technocratic paradigm. Such forms of knowledge would, quote, take into account the data generated by other fields of knowledge, including philosophy and social ethics. And I think maybe some of us can recognize here that Francis's account of aspects of the technocratic paradigm as a form of thinking resembles many contemporary concerns in higher education concerning the fragmentation and instrumentalization of knowledge and the reduction of the university's educational mission to offering a selection of technical training and professional credentialing. Francis raises important curricular questions, how to form students to have a critical awareness of the particularity and limits of the disciplinary methods in which we train them, how to cultivate critical and synthetic relationships between disciplines, how can robust interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary integration be fostered in an age where education is permeated with consumer choice and professional training models. So that's that's the technocratic paradigm and some of the questions it raises. Let's turn now to the positive proposal in the encyclical, integral ecology. So the constructive alternative to the corrosive and fragmenting force of the technocratic paradigm is integral ecology. Like the analysis of the technocratic paradigm, it's a multi-dimensional concept. And what I'm going to do tonight is suggest that you can read integral ecology as having an ontological component, an understanding of the nature of reality as a relationship, an epistemological component that cultivates attentiveness to this interrelationship, and finally, and consequently, a moral valuation of creation and its manifold relationships. So an ontology and epistemology, and then the morality follows. When considered from this multidimensional perspective, the breadth of its relevance to the curricular and institutional dimensions of Catholic higher education becomes more apparent. So the first aspect of integral ecology, as an ontology, an understanding of reality, in the words of Encyclical, seeing each creature as a caress of God. As a vision, integral ecology is an understanding, an imagination that enables us to perceive the interconnections among all things. In philosophical terms, it has an ontological component describing the nature of reality. This understanding is based upon specific doctrines, beliefs, and scriptural themes that teach these interconnections. Francis traces this understanding to the Hebrew scriptures. In his words, the creation account and the book of Genesis contain in their own specific symbolic and narrative language profound teachings about human existence and its historical reality. Human life is grounded in the three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. Francis notes that the laws found in the Bible dwell on relationships, not only among individuals, but also with other living beings, such as the obligation to help fallen beasts of burden, the prohibition on simultaneously hunting mothers and their young, even eggs, and Sabbath requirements that even donkeys and oxen be given rest. Doctrinally, this vision is rooted in the doctrine of creation itself, that is, belief in God as the creator of all things, and that all created things are thus members of one family in God. Francis cites Aquinas here. Aquinas' argument that the diversity of creatures expresses the infinite goodness of God, quote, which could not be represented fittingly by any one creature. The diversity of creatures in their multiple relationships together convey the goodness of the creator. Thus, to quote Francis, each creature has its own purpose, none is superfluous. The entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us, soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. So that's the doctrine of creation. The ultimate foundation for this vision of the interrelatedness of all things is the triune God who creates all things. In a passage that I think can be read as the spiritual core of the encyclical, Francis connects the three levels of integral ecology being discussed here with the relational nature of the triune God. In his words, the divine persons are subsistent relationships, and the world, created according to this divine model, is a web of relationships. Creatures tend towards God, and in turn, it is proper to every living being to tend towards the other things, so that throughout the universe, we can find any number of constant and secretly interwoven relationships. This understanding of creation gives rise to a way of perceiving the world that is attentive to interconnection. So the first level is this sort of dogmatic imagination that the world must be relational. And that gives rise to an epistemology that goes out attentive to those relationships, trying to find them, trying to be aware of them. So in Francis's words, this leads us not only to marvel at the manifold connections existing among creatures, but also to discover a key to our own fulfillment. And thus the third aspect here is an anthropological one. We humans don't simply notice these interrelations in the world around us, we participate in them socially and ecologically. We learn from the triune God and the created world that reflects that God, that our fulfillment and indeed our sanctification is found not in isolation, but in embracing and deepening relationships through human solidarity and care. And so there's a wonderful passage that sums this up in the encyclical. The human person grows more, matures more, and is sanctified more to the extent that he or she enters into relationships, going out from themselves to live in communion with God, with others, and with all creatures. In this way, they make their own that Trinitarian dynamism which God imprinted in them when they were created. Everything is interconnected, and thus invites us to develop a spirituality of that global solidarity which flows from the mystery of the Trinity. If Pope Francis's understanding of interconnection is rooted in the Trinity and trusts in the power of the Holy Spirit to bring all things into communion, he understands this vision to be accessible and available to people of any faith or none at all. Following in the footsteps of Pope John XXIII, who addressed his 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris on war and peace to all men and women of goodwill, Francis presents Laudato Si as a dialogue with all people about our common home. Catholicism does not separate faith and reason. Both describe the same universe. Honest openness to the world will find interconnection regardless of faith commitment or lack thereof. On the interreligious front, Laudato Si clearly engages other Abrahamic faiths, Judaism and Islam, in developing this understanding of reality. As we've seen, Francis roots integral ecology in the text of the book of Genesis. It is noteworthy that the papal encyclical, the first one ever, quotes a Sufi Muslim mystical writer, Ali al-Khawass, as a teacher calling us to recognize the mystical encounter with the divine can be found in listening to, quote, what is being said when the wind blows, the trees sway, water flows, flies buzz, doors creak, birds sing, or in the sound of strings or flutes, the sighs of the sick, the groans of the afflicted. Surprisingly, similar teachings can be found in other faith traditions as well. One key example here is the Buddhist notion of pratitya samutpada, or interbeing, interdependence. All of these are striking parallels with Pope Francis's notion of integral ecology. All right. So the second level of integral ecology I want to call attention to, and this brings us closer to what's going on in Catholic higher education, is integral ecology as a way of seeing, as an epistemology. These beliefs about God and the nature of creation inspire a way of seeing, a certain kind of gaze that serves as an epistemological alternative to the technocratic paradigm by seeking to perceive the interconnections in creation. In Francis's understanding, this epistemology is of a piece with his spiritual and theological commitments. He speaks of, quote, an attitude of heart, which approaches life with serene attentiveness, which is capable of being fully present to someone. Jesus is the supreme example of this loving gaze. Jesus taught us this attitude, quoting Francis here, when he invited us to contemplate the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. And when seeing the rich young man and knowing his restlessness, he looked at him with love. He was completely present to everyone and to everything. And in this way, he showed us the way to overcome that unhealthy anxiety, which makes us superficial, aggressive, and compulsive consumers. As you may know, the gaze of Jesus is very important to Pope Francis. The scene of Jesus' encounter with another rich young man, the calling of Matthew the tax collector, is the basis for the motto on his papal coat of arms, miserando atque eligendo. The phrase can be roughly translated as by having mercy and choosing him. Francis likes that Latin word miserando. He likes it particularly because it has no easy modern translation. It means by having mercy, or as he prefers to say, mercying. Jesus' gaze is mercying. He looks upon people and things with a love that sees the fullness of what they are and what they might be. There is always something more to someone or something than meets the eye. In Matthew's case, the something more is that wealthy tax collector for the Roman occupiers, at that time a position closer to an extortionist than a bureaucrat. This gaze could see that that person might become a great apostle. In the case of integral ecology, it is the patient openness to imagine and to understand the many interconnections among the other creatures with whom we share the world. All things around us, soil, trees, and bees, are all so much more than the simple objects that meet our eyes. They are interconnected in ways that have profound importance. Just one example, and you read the longer piece I did, some of you read the longer piece I did for Commonweal regarding soil. We know that it's more than dirt, it's where plants grow, but it's teeming with microscopic life, bacteria, fungi, microscopic animals, all essential for supporting plant life. In ecologist Otto Leopold's analysis, it is a foundation of a fountain of energy, which flows from the sun through plants and animals, which gives us life and is a community to which we give back through care as well as our own death. No soil, no humans. As you may know, the Hebrew name for the first human in the Bible, Adama, literally means being of the soil. So it's a play on the word soil. Integral ecology inspires us to gaze with the patient openness to learn these connections. And when I was in residence at an experimental forest in Oregon, sharing some of this work with a geologist there, after reading a version of this essay, he said, I want to have a gaze of serene attentiveness. That's what I'm trying to do, to see these interconnections, to look long at things. Sorry, I've lost my place. This attentive and loving gaze is not limited to Jesus. The model for integral ecology in the Encyclical is St. Francis of Assisi, whose great prayer poem, The Canticle of the Sun, provides the title for the Encyclical. In Pope Francis's words, Francis helps us to see that an integral ecology calls for an openness to categories which transcend the language of mathematics and biology and take us to the heart of what it is to be human. St. Francis was open to all of creation. He responded to it not with mere intellectual appreciation or economic calculus, but with love. Just as happens when we fall in love with someone, Francis says, whenever Francis would gaze at the sun, the moon, or the smallest animals, he burst into song, drawing all other creatures into his praise. For St. Francis, each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection. That is why he felt called to care for all that exists. So Pope Francis argues here that there's more than naive romanticism in Francis's vision. Our attitudes of love and attentiveness affect what we see, and thus what we're able to value. This is a path of transformation worth noting. For Francis, awareness of our relationships is a path of moral transformation. Awareness of relationships is where it begins. Seeing can precipitate moral conversion. It is not simply a matter of our priorities following what we love. Rather, it is that love enables us to see more of reality. If we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously, he says. So integral ecology in this second sense is a way of seeing that opens our eyes to the myriad creatures with whom we are interrelated. It helps us to understand our interdependence and thus to value the rest of creation. Laudato Si argues that we're made for this attention. The human being is made for this attention, much the same way the great naturalist E.O. Wilson argues that humans have evolved an intrinsic interest in other creatures and life processes, which he terms biophilia. Openness to the rest of creation is a value shared beyond the church. The positive relationship between religion and science is a recurring theme in Laudato Si. Although, as we saw, Francis is quite critical of the limited, narrow gaze of contemporary economics and technology, with his critique of the technocratic paradigm, it emerges as particularly noteworthy then that he generally portrays integral ecology and science as mutually enriching ways of seeing the world. He opens the chapter on integral ecology with a discussion of the science of ecology. Ecology studies the relationships between organisms and their environment. Francis expands this scientific insight from biological ecology to human society, noting that the existence of human society is as much a matter of relationship with other species as it is a matter of economic development. Integral ecology draws from scientific attentiveness to creation. Francis believes integral ecology can, in turn, contribute to science as well. He argues repeatedly that our current crises can only be solved if all dimensions of human wisdom are brought to bear. Faith has much to contribute to the scientific task, not least is the loving and attentive gaze of integral ecology to seek and know and love the depths of the things in their complex relationships. Whereas religious fundamentalists too often provoke a conflict between faith and science, Pope Francis views them as mutually enriching ways of seeking the truth. In that regard, he quotes at length from Lumen Fide, the encyclical he wrote with his predecessor, Benedict XVI. And so Benedict's vision shows up here as well. To quote that document, the gaze of science thus benefits from faith. Faith encourages the scientist to remain constantly open to reality in all its inexhaustible richness. Faith awakens the critical sense by preventing research from becoming satisfied with its own formula and helping it to realize that nature is always greater. By stimulating wonder before the profound mystery of creation, faith broadens the horizon of reason to shed greater light on the world, which discloses itself to scientific investigation. So a rather ideal vision of how faith can contribute to science. That sounds a lot more like Benedict than Francis there, but I'm sure Francis is completely for that as well. So finally, integral ecology is what everyone assumes it is. It's a moral principle. These ontological and epistemological moves form the foundation for Laudato Si's moral teaching. The married creatures and their manifold interrelationships are good. Humans should work to preserve, restore, and cultivate these interrelationships between ourselves and our fellow creatures. All right, so that's integral ecology, the second major part. The third thing I want to talk about then is to apply this to Catholic higher education. And what I'm going to argue here is that this multidimensional critique of the technocratic paradigm and the multidimensional proposal of integral ecology just gives us a lot of ways to engage this within colleges and universities, and a lot of ways to connect it up with various aspects of our mission. This analysis of the multidimensional nature of Laudato Si's critique and constructive proposal illuminates the broad possibilities of response to the ecological crisis. Its moral dimensions are paired with substantial ontological and epistemological components. Thus, it cannot be addressed with a few ethics or theology requirements. Integral ecology may provide, the basis for a broad and inclusive interdisciplinary dialogue and transdisciplinary projects to understand and address the ecological crises. So ontology, its ontological understanding of the relational character of reality provides the possibility for engagement with just about every discipline in the university, much better than moral questions do. This enables a much deeper critical conversation about the principles and methods of disciplines. While some disciplines may not provide much basis for participating in moral debates about the environmental crisis, I hesitate to pick one, but it seems like math might not have much to say about the morality of it. All disciplines construct reality in a manner specific to their discipline. All have their own resources for imagining interconnection and complexity. Ethical discussions alone can leave these fundamental interpretations of reality unchallenged, but also unengaged. Each discipline, from anthropology and finance to mechanical engineering and social work, has significant resources for attending to complex interrelationships in its own domain. And thus they can contribute to the university's work of cultivating the ontological dimensions of integral ecology, right? So every discipline imagines the world in a certain way, and it imagines complexity in a certain way. And so we can have a broad conversation about that. We can also engage in transdisciplinary work together to address this. The same holds, I think, for the epistemological aspect of integral ecology. Each discipline has its own methods for what counts as data or information, and methods for interpreting, analyzing, and employing those. They cultivate attentiveness to their own subject matter, and thus can contribute to developing the ethos of attentiveness evoked by integral ecology, right? So a big part of what students learn in a discipline is how to interpret the world in terms of the method of that discipline, right? Whether it's literature or engineering, there are certain ways of being attentive to what's being studied, and all of those have something to contribute to this conversation as well. Both of these levels of dialogue contribute not only to Laudato Si's project of responding to the ecological crisis, but also to the general educational project of the university. These interdisciplinary conversations would greatly enhance students' understandings of their own majors and of the other disciplines that they encounter. Discussions at the university, especially Catholic ones, often describe them as places of sustained critical dialogue. I remember early in my career when the implementation of Ex Corde was a constant topic of conversation. And we would always say, you know, the university is a place of dialogue, you know, and we can't be dogmatic here, and we have to engage in these things. And I was always completely for that. But then I'd return to my university and I'd noticed that, like, we very seldom talk to each other. I talk to people in Belgium more than I talk to the people upstairs in the English department, my previous university. Or we'd argue through the children like a dysfunctional family, right? I'd dress down economics in my classroom, and then they'd go over there and they'd find out, from some professors that the common good doesn't exist, and we would never actually meet each other and have an actual conversation. We might finally agree on something. Day-to-day practice often falls quite short of this idea of sustained dialogue. Faculty do the bulk of their work within their own disciplinary communities. Students encounter various disciplines through their core curriculum, but often have little or no guidance in or experience of mutual critique and synthesis. Attempting to enact the project of integral ecology raises the questions of what structures and practices at the university facilitate such dialogue. How might we have one? And I think transdisciplinary projects in sustainability programs often are places where this can happen. At our university, it's one of the places where it happens, but we need much more than, as good as that is, we need more than that. Integral ecology can also provide a focus for campus interreligious and intercultural dialogue. Questions of tolerance and inclusion can be rendered concrete by focusing on each tradition's and each culture's ontological and epistemological understanding of nature, natural relationships, and the role of humankind in them. Religious traditions also have contemplative resources that can be engaged in terms of attentiveness. So this provides a way of working together on some shared understanding of the world and talking about substantive things. Finally, integral ecology, I'm going to say, illuminates how university policies and practices concerning investments, energy use, and the campus plant have formative and educational import. If they're imagined as more than simple, or actually not so simple at all, moral questions, but as complex negotiations of the ecological consequences of our collective and institutional actions, they can serve as formation in the imagination of connection. Divestment policies can illuminate the relationships generally left unexamined in matters of finance. Carbon neutrality pledges and the difficult logistical work of achieving them are profound pedagogical opportunities that should involve as much as possible the campus community. And again, all of these things are ways of coming into awareness of the interconnections of our lives with the rest of the world. The operation of the campus physical plant, likewise, has an important and generally overlooked formative power. I love going from campus to campus and seeing the spread of native prairie plants on so many Catholic campuses, right? There's always a place where there are native plants, and that's a wonderful thing. But they're generally surrounded by extremely automatically watered lawns that remain green even during seasonal droughts. So, here's the native part. We might let that dry out. But in my own campus, August in Southwestern Ohio is a dry time. Everything should die. But, it looks like the Masters tournament all the time. Everything is green and beautiful. And so that's actually, there's a pedagogy there, right? We're not connected, Programs such as on-campus composting can form the community in deeper awareness as well of the resource and nutrient cycles in which they participate, in which case we would need to have the compost somewhere on campus where you could actually smell the pile, as opposed to sending it off to a processor, which I'm sure is better for the health code. I just offer those as some examples of how these broader dimensions of what integral ecology is doing can land really centrally in some of the fundamental debates and concerns of Catholic higher education, right? It's not simply about ethics and what we should do. It's about our understanding of reality and our ways of encountering reality. This is the bread and butter of the university. So this could become a new way of conversing and arguing together towards this end. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Was that Bill your reminder, or?
It was.
Good. So I learned, I have a number of questions about things, but let me turn things over to Norah Martin first for a response.
Thank you. This was a really wonderful opportunity for me to be thinking through a whole lot of issues. So I really appreciate Vince's paper. Vincent Miller gives us a vision of Catholic higher education through the lens of integral ecology. Catholic colleges and universities are facing many profound challenges, from the unfolding ecological and climate crisis, but also, though not Miller's focus, but certainly an issue on my campus, from the long overdue reckoning with racism and settler colonialism. Catholic colleges and universities must face all of this now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has highlighted these profound challenges. While Miller suggests integral ecology as the basis of a curriculum to address the climate and ecological crisis, I would urge him to consider that it could address these other challenges as well. How can all of these things become central to the educational and academic mission of Catholic colleges and universities? Miller shows that Laudato Si, quote, argues that the crises that we face are not simply the result of moral failure, but a failure to properly understand the nature of reality and the human person, and a failure of the dominant modes of thinking. And he argues that integral ecology, quote, can provide a guiding vision for summoning a fuller response to the ecological crises by institutions of Catholic higher education, end quote. But he does more than that. He shows that integral ecology can be the basis of the entire curriculum, and that the vision of Catholic education as transdisciplinary and focused on the interconnectedness of all knowledge and all aspects of the world is best understood through the lens of integral ecology. Pope Francis's critique of the technocratic paradigm is a critique of, as Miller puts it, a distorted imagination of the human relationship with the rest of creation. This distorted view exalts the concept of a subject who, using logical and rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object. This is a faulty epistemology that separates the human person from the world to which she is connected. The technocratic paradigm is an epistemology and a way of thinking that generalizes the methods and aims of science and technology in a way that shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society. Specialization and fragmentation, which we see in the structure of most universities, is both the source of great practical power, but also a source for a loss of appreciation for the whole and for the relationships between things. This makes it particularly inadequate for complex problems. Miller mentions in particular those regarding the environment and the poor, but I might also add problems related to racial justice and settler colonialism. Problems, in short, that in Pope Francis's words, cannot be dealt with from a single perspective or from a single set of interests. Laudato Si calls for a more integral vision, one that generates resistance to the assault of the technocratic paradigm. Miller argues that this resistance would take the form in the university of a broadly transdisciplinary curriculum that resists the fragmentation and instrumentalization of knowledge that reduces the educational mission to technical training and professional credentialing. It also resists the more traditional forms of siloed intellectual specialization. An education based in integral ecology fosters an imagination that enables us to perceive the interconnections among all things, to think like a mountain, in the evocative words of Aldo Leopold. It is an education that would take relationships rather than discrete things as the primary component of reality. Indeed, we might wonder if perhaps the modern human obsession with discrete and countable things cannot easily apprehend the capacious reality of the natural world. In his article, A Cathedral Not Made by Human Hands, Miller reflects on the complex reality of interrelationship that exceeds human understanding found in the old-growth forest. Relationships, it turns out, are what is primary, not discrete things, not individuals. And we learn from this, from the triune God and from the created world of interrelation, where connections rather than things are primary, that our human fulfillment is not found in isolation, but rather in embracing and deepening relationship through human solidarity, and our role as part of creation, as plain biotic citizens, as Aldo Leopold has put it. The vision of a world of interconnection rather than of discrete individuals is one that might decolonize the curriculum. It is a vision of a curriculum, or perhaps an anti-curriculum, that is well suited to address the various crises of our times. It would allow us to remake the curriculum from the one characterized by disciplinary boundaries and professionalization to one that is profoundly transdisciplinary and transgressive of the business as usual assumptions about disciplines. One model for this is a course we offered at University of Portland this past fall semester called Imagining Our Futures, Making Sense of COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and Climate Change. Close to 24 faculty members from across the university taught the class in a decentralized manner, both asynchronous and without a central leadership structure. More than 200 students completed the class. The result could perhaps be best analogized with an old growth forest, apparently chaotic, but with an inner logic, mutual aid, and messy beauty. Messy only from a technocratic perspective. It was also transformational for faculty and students alike. Miller has made clear that integral ecology can be the integrating basis for any curriculum. It is not a discipline, it is a vision, a way of seeing the world that better apprehends both the world and the human person, that is, as relational. Such a vision is perhaps our only hope as we stare into the abyss of climate change and perhaps civilizational collapse. It is also a healing vision, giving us hope that perhaps we can find a way to heal the racial and settler colonial violence and injustice that have for so long been part of the fabric of life under the technocratic paradigm. We have just lived through a year of unprecedented disruption, one from which we will emerge in ways we cannot yet begin to imagine. Integral ecology provides a vision of a new way of being a university, one that is prepared for a non-linear future in which we can expect far more such disruptions. What skills will this require? How will our students be prepared to face a world that is undergoing such fundamental change? How will they be able to grow stronger and wiser? They are already perhaps tending toward a way of seeing the world that is more consistent with integral ecology than have previous generations. This year, we seem to have heard more about mutual aid than we have since biologist and anarchist Peter Kropotkin first talked about it 100 years ago. And we have seen climate leadership emerge from the ranks of teenagers. A curriculum based in integral ecology may better enable our students of a post-COVID world to grapple with the enormous challenges facing them and do the great work of their generation.
Thanks, Nora. That was transgressive and disruptive in some good ways. So, Vince, any thoughts about that you want to respond to, or do you want to go to questions?
Oh, I found that enormously helpful. But yeah, let's go to questions, and maybe we'll come back to some of those questions there. But time's running out, so
People can raise their hand and chat if you want to do that. Ask me if you want to ask them. So. I was wondering, you said something about not naive romanticism, but how can we tell the difference? How do we know when that's happening and how not? So it's great to say.
Yeah. That's a fair question. Yeah, that's Francis's phrase. I would say, the difference is that naive romanticism becomes its own form of closure, right? Are you actually engaging the complexity that's there, or are you hypothesizing it? Or one of the things I worry greatly in the article that Nora referenced in Commonweal, right, is am I actually engaging science as science? Is this legit, or is this a starry-eyed Catholic theologian, running around and saying everything is connected? So the folks there seem to like what I said, but I always feel that are we actually engaging these things? Is it truly an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary engagement, or am I just lifting pieces out to confirm my worldview? I wish I had the criterion to know when that was happening and when not. But I think the ultimate issue is, right, am I really engaging, or am I just putting stars in my own constellation?
If I could just add to that, in the environmental studies department, we have people from multiple disciplines, but we have lots of people talking about systems thinking and the complexity of everything being connected. And we have actually a mathematician in the environmental studies department who is involved with the Waterloo Center on Resilience. He does mathematical modeling for them because the very complex relationships that one needs to understand in order to understand how various ecological problems emerge is something that requires very high level mathematics. So at least from the perspective of kind of the environmental studies space, that systems thinking and the idea that everything is connected, and that's why it's all so complicated and difficult to deal with, is prevalent.
In some ways, Vince, you struck me as the Catherine LaCunha now of the environment. So you connected Trinity to relationship to all these other things. I was struck too that you sort of brought in Sufism and Buddhism, and we could call them sort of more purely monotheistic focus. But so how do you, is this a Christian worldview? You want to transfer it to other people? And I love the relational part of that. So how do you say your deal with that, say with people who might come out of Islam or Judaism or something more purely monotheistic or not Trinitarian at least?
Yeah. I'm just impressed by the ability of that question to be a place to begin, right? So what is your understanding of reality? How does your understanding of reality account for interrelationships, right? And these different traditions have ways of talking about that. And so that's we can join together in that process of mutual discernment, and sharing these both imaginations of the world and also ways of encountering that world, right? So the spiritual practices and the formations in epistemology that these disciplines have, these traditions have. So rather than sort of imagining some meta way how I hold it all together, I think it's just really interesting how that opens doors between traditions for certain kinds of conversations that are valuable.
One of our questions asks, do viruses and mosquitoes too count as caresses like other creatures? Is Francis's vision of reality pre-fall, post-fall, so to speak?
Yeah.
Or are the relationships in reality messier?
Yeah, I was thinking that when you talked about regarding romanticism. Those are Francis's words, and sometimes I think it might be a little romantic. Yeah, I mean, the Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures, tends to ascribe all fallenness to humankind, right? And then, some particularly intense forms of fundamentalism want to really work this out, right? Those folks who want to say, well, mosquitoes originally, the proboscis was for drinking plant juice, but then after the fall, they went for blood. I don't find that particularly helpful. I mean,
I didn't know that. Yeah.
That's the Museum of Creation. That's one of their accounts there. Yeah, I mean, it is a theological problem, so widely debated in the past 30 years of science and religion discourse on evolution and creation, right? It's some of these things are just very, very difficult. The world is violent, not simply when it comes to meat eaters, carnivores, right? But we're all heterotrophs, right? Very few of us actually make our own energy. We eat other things. So even vegans are heterotrophs, right? So that seems to be cooked into the way this world works. And so yeah, there's some starry-eyed romanticism that needs to open its eyes to the difficulty of things. I haven't resolved that. I don't have an answer for that yet, though. Oh.
All right. I do have one practical question, but I don't know if there's anything. Mary, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, just thank you so much, for both of these. And I think I was really struck too, Norah, when you were suggesting, to kind of expand, right, and to think about other kind of interrelated issues. And I just started reading this book, Braiding Sweetgrass. It has come to me very lately, and I see people are nodding, and I was just so struck by the author in the very opening, kind of really contrasting the Genesis stories of creation and Eve's role there with her own Native American traditions and how that sort of how that creation story sort of shapes, right, the difference. But I was also, I think, really struck by, to kind of link it up to what you were saying, was Norah, is also the story of sort of the way in which Christianity and the role that it played in subduing, right, cultures and religious traditions that did have a much richer sense of this kind of interdependence. And so I feel like I'm sort of stuck because I don't know now what to do with my creation story, because it just seems completely, it had problems before, and now it just has even more problems than it did. And so I feel like I'm kind of really, you know, wrestling with the way in which Christianity really still continues in a whole lot of ways in terms of the dominion and all of that, but also the role that it played in really sort of devastating, you know, these cultures. And the other thing was the way she was talking about, you know, being a biology professor, a biology teacher, and also holding on to these very rich stories. And she asks her students, could you tell me one way in which like human beings are good for the environment, like this relationship? And it just sort of struck me when you were talking about, do we kind of romanticize, like, I'm all for them sort of squashing this virus. Like, I don't want that relationship. But the way in which they could not come up with a single example of something good that we do for the environment. And I was really struck by that. So anyway, thank you so much, because it's sort of, you're helping me kind of enter into the space of that book in some really rich ways.
Thanks.
I used that book in a couple of my classes last spring, and the students it kind of turned them around to start thinking about how humans are part of the ecosystem and are contributed to it. And the story that she has about halfway through the book about the sweetgrass itself, and the study that her student did of sweetgrass. I don't know if you've gotten to that part of it, but that this, well, you'll love that part of it.
Yeah, I think in that regard, I think, I thank Norah for bringing up the question of colonialism and its role in this, and current needs to address that within the university context. My assignment was to do the Technocratic Paradigm and Laudato Si. I don't think the Technocratic Paradigm is incompatible with this bigger analysis, but doesn't really go into it. So the 500-year project, as Dan Castillo calls it, of colonialism is it's the source of so much of this, right? So we this view of everywhere but Europe as being terras nullius, as empty land, right? That the Europeans could take, that they could exploit, with no engagement with the humans and cultures that lived there, because we didn't think they had improved it, right? An improvement in our imagination involved it, basically destroying it. And we thought that we could have access to those resources without any imagination in reference to the ecosystems in which they dwelled. So that's the origins of what the Encyclical calls the Technocratic Paradigm. And I think any sort of full accounting of that would have to situate it within that broader history. And I also think the Technocratic Paradigm touches on the closer end. It touches a little bit on neoliberalism, but I think Matthew Eggmeyer was here a little bit ago, but neoliberalism is really a profound transformation and intensification of those dynamisms in its own way that needs to be accounted for. So I think a bigger story would have to go both directions. So.
Matthew texted he's running off to prepare his talk on neoliberalism tomorrow, so he enjoyed the talk a great deal. One practical question that came in the chat, and I hesitate because the question, most faculty I know are terribly bad at practical questions, but especially this one. Do you have any suggestions for engaging the physical plant and making a campus more sustainable? And I can think of all the suggestions I've heard from colleagues about that are usually not enormously helpful about that. But I don't know if you have ideas. My answer to that would be that actually our students, Mary, a year or two ago, decided, the seniors said they kind of forced on the college a sustainability officer, a young woman who's come in, who's embedded in that office, and it's her job to do that. And it's not just faculty saying you shouldn't use weed whackers or mulch or do whatever, but it's a kind of inside expertise sort of thing. And more than faculty can tell them that till they turn blue, but That's my best practice answer for them. I don't know if all schools can afford that, but in this case, the students forced it on the college. Any other thoughts to that question from someone?
It seems to me that one of the things is that it's often not up to physical plant. So Vince had mentioned, the green, everything is green in August. And to challenge that is not to ask physical plant to stop watering, because it's actually people much higher up that are insisting that everything be green and beautiful.
In August, yeah.
Yeah.
In May and August, right? Especially, so. Okay.
I mean, you've heard what I had to say, but I imagine, I would really like to move the symbolic prairies more deeply into the campus, in campuses that are in prairie biomes, and so that students could know what those biomes are like, how they work. The problem is also, one of the economically great things the university does, at least at UD, right, is we have all these groundskeepers who get employee benefits, and their children get to come to the University of Dayton. So I don't want to put them out of business either. But there'd be plenty to do with these things. But I think there's a real pedagogical value to wherever you are, reestablishing the connections between that physical space and the ecological space in which it's located.
Thank you for Vince for a great thought-provoking talk. Thanks to Norah for a wonderful response to that. Thanks to everyone for being here, and have a great night.